Look, I didn't wake up that Tuesday morning in Carmel, Indiana, planning to declare a federal war over a rusted piece of scrap metal. I mean, I really didn't. It was like barely past 7 in the morning. The air had that ridiculous, biting Midwest chill that makes your bones ache before you've even had a chance to blink properly, and the dew on the aggressively manicured lawns of the Whispering Pines subdivision was practically freezing into solid ice. I was standing at the end of my driveway, clutching a frankly necessary mug of black coffee, wearing a completely faded, deeply unflattering gray fleece bathrobe and just staring. I was staring at Richard. Richard was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. He was a man who, honestly, looked exactly like you'd expect an HOA president to look. He was probably pushing 60, with a aggressively neat comb-over that defied the morning breeze, wearing pleated khakis and a windbreaker that somehow managed to look both expensive and entirely devoid of personality. And right at that exact moment, Richard was on his hands and knees in my damp mulch, wrestling with a bright yellow Stanley tape measure. "Richard," I said, taking a slow, painful sip of my coffee. "I mean this with all the disrespect in the world. What are you doing in my bushes at 7:15 in the morning?" He didn't look up. He just kept grunting, pulling the tape measure tight against the base of the wooden post. "It's a violation, Jack. A blatant, flagrant violation of Article 4, Section B, Paragraph 9 of the Community Aesthetic Guidelines." "It's a mailbox, Richard," I sighed, shifting my weight on the cold concrete. "It literally just holds paper. Mostly junk mail and coupons for roofing companies I don't need." He finally snapped the tape measure back with a loud, metallic clack and stood up, brushing a microscopic speck of dirt off his knee. His face was flushed with the kind of self-righteous fury that only a retired regional sales manager can muster. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the object in question. "That," he sputtered, his voice cracking slightly with indignation, "that is not a mailbox. That is an eyesore. It is a rusty, tetanus-inducing monstrosity that is dragging down the property value of this entire cul-de-sac." I looked at it. Honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong about the aesthetic part. But that wasn't the point. My mailbox was, without a doubt, a masterpiece of terrible art. A buddy of mine who did custom welding in Indianapolis had made it for me as a joke a few years back, and when I moved into Whispering Pines, I brought it with me specifically because I knew the neighborhood was overwhelmingly, suffocatingly beige. The mailbox was shaped like a life-sized, incredibly depressed-looking manatee. It was welded together from heavy-gauge scrap steel, old car parts, and what I suspected was a repurposed propane tank for the torso. It weighed roughly 80 pounds. It was painted a mottled, industrial gray that had already begun to rust beautifully around the flippers. The mouth of the manatee was on a heavy iron hinge. You pulled the snout down to put the mail in, and it clanged shut with a sound like a bank vault locking. But here was the kicker, the absolute most important detail that Richard was entirely ignoring. Stamped right into the thick metal plate on the top of the manatee's head, right between its sad little welded eyes, were the words, "Approved by the Postmaster General." "It's custom," I said, leaning against my car. "And it's federal property, Richard. The post office loves it. My mailman, Gary, thinks it's hilarious. He says it's the highlight of his route." "I don't care what Gary thinks," Richard practically shrieked, whipping out a clipboard that had, I kid you not, a laminated stack of violation forms clipped to it. "The bylaws clearly state that all residential mail receptacles must be standard, archtop, matte black aluminum, mounted on a 4x4 treated cedar post painted in Whispering Pines white. This aquatic garbage heap is none of those things. It's a manatee, Richard. Have some respect. It is a violation." He scribbled furiously on the pad, his pen gouging into the paper. He ripped the top sheet off with a flourish that was honestly just a bit too dramatic for a Tuesday morning. He thrust it toward me. "You have exactly 48 hours to remove this eyesore and replace it with an approved receptacle, or the board will take corrective action and bill you for the labor. Furthermore, you will be fined $100 for every day this thing remains on the property." I didn't take the paper. I just took another sip of coffee. "I'm not moving it, Richard. I guess you'll just have to fine me." "Don't push me, Jack," he sneered, his face turning an impressive shade of plum. "I have the authority. The board has the authority. We keep order here. We don't tolerate rebellion." I laughed, finally taking the pink slip from his shaking hand. "It's a metal sea cow, dude. You're acting like I'm building a nuclear silo in the front yard. Go home." Drink some decaf. Leave my mailbox alone. He glared at me, a look of pure, unadulterated neighborhood hatred. 48 hours, Jack, he hissed, before turning on his heel and marching back up the street toward his impeccably sterile McMansion. I rolled my eyes, walked back inside, and tossed the violation notice onto the kitchen counter. I honestly didn't think he'd actually do anything. I mean, sure, he was a petty tyrant. But taking down a man's mailbox? That seemed like a lot of physical labor for a guy who got winded pulling his trash cans to the curb. I figured I'd get some fines in the mail, I'd throw them away, we'd have a stupid legal mediation in 6 months, and the manatee would stay. I was wrong. I vastly underestimated the sheer malicious audacity of a bored man with a tiny shred of power. 2 days later, I came home from a brutally long day at the office. I pulled into my driveway, shifted the car into park, and just froze. The sunset was casting long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly edged lawns of whispering pines. But my eyes were locked on the end of my driveway. The manatee was gone. It wasn't just gone. The entire post had been ripped out of the ground. There was nothing left but a jagged, ugly crater of displaced dirt and shredded mulch. I got out of the car, my heart pounding with a sudden, very real surge of anger. I walked over to the hole. There were tire tracks from a heavy truck, pressed deep into my grass, and a few stray wood splinters. They had literally sent a crew to tear it out of the earth. "You have got to be kidding me," I muttered, looking down the street toward Richard's house. His lights were on. His standard, matte black, arch-top mailbox stood proudly at the end of his driveway. I didn't even go inside. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed the non-emergency line for the Carmel Police Department. I knew it was a stretch, but someone had just rolled onto my property and stolen an 80-pound steel sculpture. It took about 45 minutes for a cruiser to finally roll slowly down the cul-de-sac. 2 officers got out. One was an older guy with a thick mustache, who looked like he was about 3 days away from retirement, and the other was a younger cop who looked like he was still trying to figure out how his duty belt worked. "Evening, sir," the older cop, Officer Miller said, tipping his hat slightly. "Dispatch said there was a report of theft and property damage." "Yeah," I said, pointing at the dirt hole. "My mailbox, the HOA president, Richard, he sent someone to steal it today while I was at work." Miller looked at the hole, then looked at me, then let out a long, heavy sigh. He pulled a small notepad out of his pocket. "Okay, let's get some details. What kind of mailbox was it?" "It was custom," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "It was made of welded steel. It was shaped like a manatee." The younger cop snorted, quickly covering his mouth. Miller shot him a look, but I could tell Miller was struggling, too. "A manatee, sir?" "Yes, a manatee." "Look, it doesn't matter what it looked like. It was my property, and it was stamped and approved by the Postmaster General. The HOA had it ripped out of the ground." Miller shook his head, capping his pen. "Listen, Mr. Jack. Listen, Jack. I'm going to shoot straight with you. We know Richard. We get called to this subdivision about twice a week because of him. The guy is a headache. But this is a civil matter." "A civil matter," I echoed, my voice rising a little. "They trespassed on my property and stole something that belongs to me." "It's an HOA dispute," Miller said, his tone shifting into that practiced. "Calm down the civilian cadence. You signed a contract when you bought the house agreeing to their bylaws. If he claims the mailbox was a violation, and their bylaws allow for corrective action, then it's a dispute between you and the board. We can't arrest the guy for enforcing his own neighborhood rules." "It's a federal offense to tamper with a mail receptacle," I argued, grasping at straws. "Only if it interferes with the delivery of the mail," Miller countered smoothly. "And since there's no mailbox here right now, no mail was interfered with today. Look, Jack, I get it. It sucks. But I cannot go lock up Richard over a metal sea cow. If you want my advice, just go down to Home Depot, buy a standard black box, stick it on a post, and save yourself the high blood pressure. Take him to small claims court for the cost of the old one if you really want to." "He destroyed my property," I said, feeling that cold, hard knot of pure spite forming in my stomach. "File a civil suit," the younger cop chimed in, sounding entirely unhelpful. They left 10 minutes later, having done absolutely nothing but write down a completely useless incident report. I stood in my driveway, staring at the empty dirt hole, the streetlights flickering on around the neighborhood. I felt a very specific kind of rage. It wasn't the hot, screaming kind. It was the cold, calculating kind. The kind that makes you want to systematically dismantle someone's life using nothing but paperwork and patience. The next morning, the real bullying began. I walked out my front door to head to work, and there, taped securely to my front door, was a bright pink envelope. I ripped it off and opened it. It was a formal letter from the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors. It was signed by Richard. Dear homeowner, as you are aware, your unapproved mail receptacle was removed by an authorized contractor on Tuesday afternoon at the board's texts. You will see a charge of $250. 00 applied to your next monthly statement for this labor. Furthermore, as of this morning, your property is currently in violation of Article 4, Section A, failure to maintain an approved mail receptacle. As per the bylaws, you will be fined $100. 00 for every 24-hour period that your property remains without an approved, standard issue mailbox. Govern yourself accordingly. I literally laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. He stole my mailbox, charged me for the theft, and was now fining me for not having a mailbox. It was a perfectly enclosed loop of bureaucratic extortion. I didn't go to Home Depot. I didn't buy a standard black box. I went to work, I came home, and I left the hole in the ground exactly as it was. That night, I sat at my kitchen table. The house was quiet. I poured myself 2 fingers of a decently expensive Kentucky bourbon, booted up my laptop, and cracked my knuckles. I was done playing neighborhood games. If Richard wanted to hide behind rulebooks and guidelines, fine. I would find a bigger rulebook. I started digging. I bypassed state law. I bypassed county ordinances. I went straight to the top. I opened up the official website for the United States Postal Inspection Service and the Federal Legal Code. I started reading through Title 18 of the United States Code. It took me about 3 hours of scrolling through dense, mind-numbing legal jargon before I found it. I practically spilled my bourbon when my eyes locked onto the text. It was beautiful. It was poetry. It was the exact silver bullet loophole I needed to utterly destroy Richard's entire existence. 18 U.S. Code 1702. Obstruction of correspondence. I read the text out loud to my empty kitchen, savoring every single word. Whoever takes any letter, postal card, or package out of any post office or any authorized depository for mail matter, or from any letter or mail carrier, or which has been in any post office or authorized depository, or in the custody of any letter or mail carrier, before it has been delivered to the person to whom it was directed, with design to obstruct the correspondence, or to pry into the business or secrets of another, or opens, secretes, embezzles, or destroys the same, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 5 years, or both. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. Richard thought he was a god because he had a laminated clipboard and a gated community, but he was about to learn a very hard lesson about federal supremacy. An HOA board has power, but the United States Postal Service? The USPS does not mess around. They have their own federal law enforcement wing. They have armed inspectors. They can, and will, ruin your life for messing with the mail. Since I currently had no mailbox, thanks to Richard's illegal contractor, the post office couldn't deliver my mail, which meant I had to intervene. I had to make sure my mail went somewhere safe, somewhere approved. I clicked over to the official USPS's website and opened up Form 3575, the official change of address form. I typed in my current address in Whispering Pines. Then, I moved down to the forwarding address section. I smiled as my fingers clacked against the keyboard, typing out the new destination for every single piece of correspondence meant for me. 1422 Whispering Pines Boulevard, Carmel, Indiana, Richard's house. But I couldn't just stop there. I mean, if I was going to legally mandate that Richard become my personal mail guardian, I needed to make sure he was guarding a substantial amount of material. I didn't get much mail usually. Mostly bills I paid online anyway. That wasn't going to be enough to make a point. I needed volume. I needed mass. I needed sheer physical weight. I spent the next 4 hours on the internet, fueled by spite and bourbon. I didn't sleep. I became a machine. I went to every single website I could think of. I signed up for catalogs. Not just clothing catalogs. I found companies that sold heavy-duty industrial farming equipment and requested their annual 400-page glossy directories. I signed up for religious pamphlets from organizations I had never heard of. I requested info packets from massive commercial real estate firms. I signed up for Yulin catalogs, which are practically phone books. I requested travel brochures from every tourism board in all 50 states. I checked every single box on every single request more information page I could find. By the time the sun started coming up on Wednesday morning, my eyes were bloodshot, My back was aching, and I had successfully triggered what I estimated to be roughly 30 to 40 pounds of high gloss. Heavy stock paper to be routed through the federal postal system directly to Richard's front door over the next few weeks. I closed my laptop, walked over to the window, and looked out at the sunrise over my empty dirt hole. "You wanted to enforce the rules, Richard," I whispered to the empty glass. "Let's see how you handle federal law." I took a shower, got dressed, and headed out the door. But before I went to the office, I had one more stop to make. I needed to ensure that when the time came, I was ready to rebuild. And I needed to make sure that the next time someone tried to pull my mailbox out of the earth, they were going to need a backhoe and a stick of dynamite to do it. I drove across town to a local landscaping and concrete supply yard. I parked and walked into the dusty, chaotic main office. Behind the counter was a guy roughly the size of a commercial refrigerator, wearing a high-vis vest and a trucker hat that just said dirt. "Can I help you?" he grumbled, not looking up from a pile of invoices. "Yeah," I said. "Are you Mike?" He looked up, sizing me up. "Who's asking?" "A guy with a very specific, very heavy problem. I need a contractor. I need a concrete footing poured. And I need it done quietly, quickly, and with an absurd amount of structural integrity." Mike set his pen down. A slow, knowing smile crept across his face. He leaned over the counter. "What are we mounting, boss? A structural support beam? A commercial flagpole? A mailbox?" I said, completely deadpan. "Shaped like a manatee." Mike stared at me for a long, silent moment. Then, he let out a massive, booming laugh that rattled the windows of the office. "Oh man, tell me this is an HOA thing. Please tell me you're sticking it to a neighborhood association." "The president of the board stole my last one," I admitted. "I'm putting it back. And I want to make sure that if he tries to pull it out again, he takes the entire sidewalk with it." Mike slapped his hand on the counter. "I love it. I absolutely love it. You want overkill? I give you overkill. We're talking a 3-foot-deep, sonotube-lined hole. We're talking rebar reinforcement, tied and welded. We're talking commercial-grade, quick-set concrete, 5,000 psi. When I'm done, a tornado could rip your house off its foundation. But that sea cow is going to still be sitting there, holding your electric bill." "That is exactly what I want to hear," I said. "When can you dig?" "I can have a crew out there on Friday," Mike said, pulling out a fresh invoice pad. "But here's the deal. We dig the hole, we pour the concrete, we set the anchor bolts. But we don't mount the box until you say the word. If this guy's as crazy as you say, we wait until the dust settles. You give me the green light. I come out with the torque wrench and lock it down." "Deal," I said. We shook on it. I gave him the address and a deposit, and walked back out to my car feeling lighter than I had in days. The trap was set, the foundation was being laid. Now, all I had to do was wait for the federal postal system to do what it does best: deliver. The first few days were quiet. Richard kept slipping fines onto my door every morning. $100, $200, $300. I just kept taking the pink slips, folding them neatly, and putting them in a drawer. I didn't say a word to him. If I drove past him walking his absurdly groomed labradoodle, I just smiled and waved. He glared back, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, assuming he had broken my spirit. But then, the following Tuesday arrived, exactly 1 week after the manatee had been removed. I was working from home that day. Around 2 in the afternoon, I saw the familiar white UPS truck turn onto the cul-de-sac. My mailman, Gary, pulled up to the cluster of mailboxes at the end of the street. Usually he was done with our section in about 5 minutes. Today he was parked there for a while. I watched through the blinds as Gary got out of the truck. He walked around to the back and pulled up the rolling door. He reached in and pulled out a large, heavy plastic bin. He carried it over to Richard's house. Richard had one of those fancy, built-in brass mail slots right in his heavy oak front door. Gary stood on the porch, shaking his head, and started feeding mail through the slot. It wasn't just letters. I watched him physically struggle to shove a massive, thick catalog through the narrow opening. He had to bend it, twist it, and force it through. It took him a solid 4 minutes just to get through half the bin. He finally gave up on the slot, stacked the remaining massive catalogs and padded envelopes directly on Richard's welcome mat, and walked back to his truck, looking visibly confused. The flood had begun. The next day it was worse. I watched Gary drag 2 bins to Richard's porch. The brass slot was jammed completely full by the 3rd magazine. So Gary just started building a fortress of glossy paper around the front door. There were farming catalogs, Yulin phone books, medical supply brochures, and a particularly large package from a company that sold bulk industrial lubricants. All of it had my name on it, all of it legally routed to Richard's address. By Thursday, the situation at 1422 Whispering Pines Boulevard was critical. Richard's immaculate porch looked like a recycling center had exploded. I decided it was time to check the temperature of the water. I needed to see him sweat. I timed my afternoon walk perfectly, strolling past his house just as he pulled into his driveway from whatever golf course he haunted during the day. Richard got out of his car, took one look at his front porch, and literally dropped his golf bag onto the concrete. "Hey, Richard," I called out cheerfully, strolling up the sidewalk. "Beautiful afternoon, huh?" He spun around, his eyes wild, his face perfectly red. He pointed a shaking finger at the mountain of paper burying his welcome mat. What is the meaning of this, Jack? What are you doing?" "What do you mean?" I asked, putting my hands in my pockets and looking the picture of innocence. "This," he screamed, his voice echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding houses. "My porch is covered in garbage, industrial tractor catalogs, 10 pounds of religious tracts. It all has your name on it." "Oh, that," I smiled, letting a look of immense relief wash over my face. "Richard, thank you so much, honestly. I was getting worried about where my mail was going to go, since my mailbox was illegally stolen, and I don't have a federally approved receptacle anymore. I had to file an official change of address with the United States Postal Service so I wouldn't miss any important documents. Since you're the HOA president, and you took responsibility for my mailbox situation, I figured your address was the most secure place for my mail to be delivered." Richard stared at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from me to the pile of catalogs and back to me. The realization was hitting him, but his ego was fighting it every step of the way. You rerouted your mail to my house, he finally choked out. "Legally and officially," I nodded, "through the proper federal channels. Form 3575. So, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just grab my stuff and get out of your hair." I walked past him, stepped onto his porch, and grabbed an armful of the heaviest catalogs. "Thanks again, Richard. You're a lifesaver. Keep it safe for me tomorrow, okay?" I walked away, leaving him standing in his driveway, practically vibrating with rage. Over the weekend, I didn't collect my mail. I let it sit. I let it fester. By Monday morning, Richard's porch was entirely inaccessible. The mail carrier had resorted to leaving plastic tubs on the bottom step because there was physically nowhere else to put anything. On Monday evening, I decided to push the button. I needed him to cross the line from annoyed neighbor to federal criminal. I walked down the street holding my phone casually at my side, the camera recording video completely silent. I approached his house. Richard was out in the yard, holding a leaf blower, aggressively blasting non-existent leaves off his perfectly clean driveway. He saw me coming and shut the blower off. "Richard," I said, my voice calm, polite, "I'm here to collect my mail. I saw Gary drop it off earlier." Richard snapped. The hubris, the entitlement, the sheer blind rage of being outplayed finally broke his brain. He marched right up to me, his face inches from mine, completely ignoring the fact that my phone was pointed right at his chest. "There is no mail here for you, Jack," he sneered, spitting slightly. "I am done playing your childish games." "What do you mean there's no mail?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Gary delivered 2 bins today. I saw him." "Where is my mail, Richard?" "It's gone," he barked, crossing his arms. "Gone where?" I pressed. "Did you put it inside?" "I need my correspondence, Richard. Some of those Uline catalogs are very important for my business." "I threw it away," he screamed, losing the last shred of his composure. "I took every single piece of that garbage, every magazine, every pamphlet, and I threw it straight into the county recycling bin this morning. And the garbage truck took it away. I am not your personal postman, and I will not allow you to trash my property." I stared at him. The silence hung in the air for a long, heavy moment. "You threw away my mail?" I asked softly. "Yes," he yelled. "And if you send one more piece of trash to my house, I'll burn it on the front lawn." I looked down at my phone. The red timer on the screen read 02:04. I hit the stop button. I looked back up at Richard. I couldn't help it. I smiled, a wide, terrifying, utterly victorious smile. "Richard," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of the snark from before. "Do you know what 18 U.S. Code Section 1702 is?" He blinked, thrown off by the shift in my tone. "What are you talking about?" "It's the federal law regarding the obstruction of correspondence," I said, taking a step back. "It specifically states that anyone who takes mail that has been in an authorized depository before it has been delivered to the person to whom it was directed and destroys the same, commits a federal felony, punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison. Richard's face faltered. The red flush drained away, replaced by a sudden sickly pale color. You're bluffing. It was junk mail. The federal government doesn't differentiate between a power bill and a tractor catalog, Richard, I said smoothly. Mail is mail, you just admitted, on high-definition video with clear audio, to intentionally destroying federally protected correspondence routed to me via an official US change of address mandate. You can't record me without my permission, he stammered, backing away slightly. Indiana is a one-party consent state, Richard, I replied, tapping my phone. I consent to this recording. And honestly, I think the regional postal inspector is going to find this footage incredibly compelling. I didn't wait for his response. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back, but I could hear his rapid, panicked breathing all the way from the sidewalk. When I got home, I didn't call the police. I bypassed local law enforcement entirely. I went to the official website of the United States Postal Inspection Service. I filled out an online complaint form for mail theft and destruction of mail. I attached the video file. I detailed the history, the illegal removal of my PMG-approved mailbox by the HOA, the forced change of address, and the subsequent destruction of my mail by the HOA president. I submitted the form. Then, I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch, and waited for the explosion. I didn't have to wait long. The next evening, around 7 o'clock, the familiar red and blue lights flashed through my living room window. I looked out. It was the local Carmel PD again. The exact same 2 officers, Miller and the rookie. They were parked in front of my house. I opened the front door before they even reached the porch. "Evening, officers," I said. "Let me guess, Richard called you." Miller looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had seriously reconsidered his career choices over the last 24 hours. "Yes, Jack," Richard called us. "He's claiming you're harassing him, dumping trash on his property, and secretly recording him to threaten him." I leaned against the doorframe. "Did he mention the part where he destroyed my mail?" "He mentioned you sent a bunch of junk mail to his house," the rookie chimed in, trying to sound authoritative. "You can't use the mail system to harass people, sir." "I didn't," I said simply. "My mailbox was illegally removed. I filed a standard change of address so I could receive my mail. That is a legal federal process. Richard took it upon himself to throw that mail in the garbage before I could retrieve it." "Jack, look," Miller sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We're not here to arrest you, but you need to stop poking the bear. This is escalating. Richard is talking about filing a restraining order. Just cancel the mail forwarding. Go buy a black mailbox. Be done with it." "I can't," I said. "Why not?" Miller asked, his voice tight with frustration. "Because," I said, stepping back and gesturing to the kitchen table, "I don't have jurisdiction over this anymore. The federal government does." I walked over to the table, picked up a printed sheet of paper, and handed it to Miller. It was a printout of the confirmation email I had received from the United States Postal Inspection Service, complete with a case number and the name of the assigned federal investigator. Miller took the paper. He read it. I watched his eyes scan the words United States Postal Inspection Service, case assignment, and felony destruction of correspondence. I watched all the color drain out of Officer Miller's face. He easily lowered the paper. He looked at me, then looked down the street toward Richard's house. The weary, annoyed demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, calculating look of a cop who suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a jurisdictional minefield. "You reported this to the postal inspectors?" Miller asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. "I gave them the video of Richard confessing to destroying the mail," I confirmed. "They take that stuff very seriously, Officer Miller. I'm sure you know that. Federal felony. 5 years. The rookie leaned over, looking at the paper. "Wait, the post office has police?" Miller didn't even look at his partner. He just handed the paper back to me. He took a deep breath. "Jack," Miller said softly, "I need you to stay right here. Do not leave your house. Do not go near Richard." "I have no intention of doing so," I smiled. Miller turned on his heel and walked briskly back to the cruiser. He didn't get in. He stood by the open door, grabbed his radio, and started speaking into it rapidly, his eyes locked on Richard's house down the street. The rookie jogged after him, looking confused. I stood in my doorway and watched. They didn't drive away. They got back in the car, pulled a U-turn, and drove slowly down the cul-de-sac, parking directly in front of Richard's house. The local PD wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal postal crime. They weren't going to arrest Richard. They couldn't. But they sure as hell were going to go tell him exactly how much trouble he was in and make sure their own incident reports reflected that they had warned him. I watched from my porch as Miller knocked on Richard's door. Richard answered, looking smug, probably expecting to see me in handcuffs. I couldn't hear the dialogue, but I could read the body language. Miller held up a hand to stop Richard from speaking. Miller talked for about 2 minutes straight. Richard's smug posture collapsed. He visibly slumped against his own doorframe, clutching his chest like he was having a heart attack. Miller handed him a card, pointed a stern finger at his chest, and walked back to the cruiser. The panic had officially set in. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following night at the community clubhouse. Usually, these meetings were attended by Richard, the board's secretary, a terrified woman named Susan, and maybe 3 or 4 elderly residents who wanted to complain about people parking on the end street. When I walked through the double-glass doors of the clubhouse at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, it was standing room only. Word travels fast in a subdivision. People had seen the cops at my house. They had seen the cops at Richard's house. They had seen the literal mountain of catalogs on his porch. The air in the room was electric with gossip and tension. I walked to the back of the room and leaned against the wall. Richard was sitting at the folding table at the front of the room. He looked terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes. His hair was slightly unkempt, and his hands were trembling as he shuffled his stack of papers. He looked like a man who was waiting for the FBI to kick the doors in. Susan tapped the microphone. Call to order. We have a lot on the agenda tonight, but we will start with open forum. Does anyone have any new business? I raised my hand. Richard saw me. He physically flinched. He leaned over to Susan and whispered frantically. Susan shook her head and gestured to me. Yes, Jack, you have the floor. I pushed off the wall and walked slowly down the center aisle. The room fell dead silent. Everyone turned to watch me. I stopped right in front of the folding table, looking down at Richard. Hello, Richard. Hello, board members, I said, projecting my voice so the whole room could hear. I'm here to discuss the status of my mailbox and the associated fines. Richard cleared his throat, his voice weak. Jack, as we have previously discussed, your receptacle was not in compliance. I'm going to stop you right there, Richard, I interrupted, my tone sharp, commanding. I wasn't playing the snarky neighbor anymore. I was closing the trap. Let's put the aesthetic guidelines aside for a moment. Let's talk about federal law. I pulled a manila folder out from under my arm and slapped it onto the folding table. Inside this folder, I said, addressing the room, is documentation proving that the mailbox Richard had illegally ripped out of my yard was officially stamped and approved by the United States Postmaster General, which makes it federal property. Furthermore, I have a copy of the official case file opened by the United States Postal Inspection Service regarding the destruction of my rerouted mail. A felony crime that Richard admitted to on camera. A collective gasp went through the room. Whispers erupted. Susan dropped her pen. Richard stared at the folder like it was a live grenade. Jack, he pleaded softly. I have accrued exactly $1,200 in fines for failing to have an approved mailbox, I continued, ignoring him. Fines issued by a man who stole the mailbox in the first place, and then committed a federal offense to avoid dealing with the consequences of his own actions. I leaned over the table, resting my hands on the plastic edge, getting right in Richard's face. So here is my proposal to the board, I said quietly but firmly. You are going to immediately revoke all fines levied against my property. You are going to reimburse me the $250 you charged me to steal my property. And you are going to issue a formal, written guarantee that no member of this HOA board will ever set foot on my property or touch my mail receptacle ever again. If you agree to these terms, I will contact the federal investigator and inform them that the dispute has been civilly resolved, and I do not wish to press charges. If you refuse, I let the sentence hang. The implication was clear. Susan, the secretary, didn't even hesitate. She grabbed her microphone. I moved to accept Jack's terms and immediately waive all fines and fees regarding the mailbox issue. Seconded, yelled the treasurer. A guy named Dave who looked like he was about to bolt for the door to avoid being named as an accomplice. All in favor? Susan asked. Every single board member raised their hand, except Richard. He just sat there, staring blankly at the table, completely defeated. The motion passes, Susan declared, her voice shaking with relief. She looked at Richard. Richard, I think it might be best if we discuss your immediate resignation from the presidency. I didn't stick around for the rest of the meeting. I had what I wanted. I turned around and walked out of the clubhouse, the sound of the neighborhood immediately turning on Richard, echoing behind me. The next morning, I called Mike the contractor. "Big Mike," I said when he picked up. "We are green-lit. Bring the heavy machinery." Mike laughed. "I'm on my way." 3 hours later, a massive commercial concrete mixing truck backed into my driveway. Mike and a crew of 3 guys jumped out. They brought the manatee. It looked glorious. A little dirtier from its time in captivity, but intact. They dug out the hole. They dropped in a massive cardboard sonotube. They tied together a cage of half-inch steel rebar and dropped it in. Then, they filled the entire 3-foot hole with industrial strength, quick-setting concrete. While it was still wet, Mike sank 4 massive stainless steel anchor bolts deep into the mix. We waited an hour for it to cure. Then, Mike and 2 of his guys hoisted the 80-pound metal sea cow into the air, lined up the base plate, and dropped it onto the bolts. Mike pulled out a massive pneumatic impact wrench. Brr, clack, clack, clack. He tightened those bolts down until the metal groaned. He stepped back, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and grinned at me. "Boss," Mike said, patting the manatee on its rusted steel head, "you could hook a Ford F-250 to this thing and hit the gas, and the truck's bumper would tear off before this post even wiggled. This is permanent." "It's beautiful, Mike," I smiled, shaking his hand and handing him an envelope with the final payment. They packed up and drove away. I stood in my driveway, admiring my rusted, ugly, incredibly secure masterpiece. About 20 minutes later, I saw someone walking slowly down the sidewalk. It was Richard. He was out of his usual khakis, wearing sweatpants, and looking 10 years older. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the mailbox. He just kept his eyes fixed firmly on the concrete as he walked past my house. He was carrying a small plastic grocery bag. He stopped at the edge of my driveway, hesitated, and then slowly walked up to me. He didn't say a word. He just reached into the plastic bag, pulled out a stack of rubber-banded mail, and handed it to me. It was a mix of standard bills and a few surviving Uline catalogs that he had been too terrified to throw away after our last conversation. I took the mail. "Thanks, Richard," I said. He nodded once, turned around, and walked back to his house. He officially resigned from the board later that week. The new president was a nice lady named Martha, who honestly didn't care what color your house was painted as long as you didn't blast loud music after 10 o'clock. It's been about a year since the great Mailbox War of Whispering Pines. The manatee is still there. In fact, it's actually started to rust a little bit more, giving it this really nice, earthy patina. It's become something of a weird local landmark. Gary the mailman still laughs every time he pulls down the heavy iron snout to deliver my electric bill. And as for me, the HOA leaves me entirely alone. They don't send me violation notices, they don't complain about my lawn, and they certainly don't touch my property. I guess they realize that when you try to use petty rules to bully someone, you better make sure they don't know how to use federal law to bury you. Never mess with a man's manatee, and definitely, under any circumstances, never mess with the United States Postal Service. They have more power than God, and they have no sense of humor about their mail.